Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to the Thanksgiving edition of the Wolfman Chronicles. Clay is out of town, but we have a very special guest reading this week's episode, my son, Jack. You'll probably hear the horses in the background. They're really noisy today, along with my granddaughter, who is 2, trying to read along with Daddy. So sit back and enjoy the story.
Welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles. This is Book 6, Episode 66. Chapter 2, An Ancient Curse, Werewolves in Ireland. This chapter takes place on Achill Island, just off the west coast of Ireland. Marked by rugged mountains and peat bogs, the island is known for its tall sea cliffs and clean beaches. The morning broke with an eerie stillness, the kind that made the hair on Jack's arms stand on end as he jolted awake. His heart pounded, the remnants of a dream, a chase through fog-drenched woods clinging to him like a shadow. The clock on the bedside table blinked 5:55, the green digits casting an otherworldly glow. He reached for Sasha and found she was not there. He'd barely risen and grabbed his robe before Sasha's piercing scream shattered the quiet. Jack was on his feet in an instant, rushing downstairs to the front door where Sasha stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth. On the doorstep lay a severed head of a sheep, its lifeless eyes staring blankly, blood pooling around it in crimson arcs. Sasha stepped aside, allowing Jack to pass. He knelt down, the metallic tang of fresh blood hitting his nose as he examined the gruesome scene. The head was cleanly severed, the horns slick with rainwater and something darker. Jack's mind churned. Was this a warning? Or a gift? Either way, it was deliberate. Sasha returned moments later with a wet towel and a trash bag, her face pale with shock and fear. She handed him his phone and he snapped a few quick photos of the grisly offering before carefully grasping the horns and lowering it into the bag Sasha held open. The weight of it surprised him, heavier than he expected. Still warm. As Jack straightened, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Should he have called the guards, the Irish police, before touching anything? Disturbing the scene could complicate an investigation into whoever left the animal's head on his doorstep. His jaw tightened. It's too late now, he murmured, sealing the bag with a final twist and setting it aside. He pulled out his phone, dialing the number for the local guards. The call rang endlessly before cutting off, leaving only silence on the other end. Frustration crept over him as he tried once more, only to meet the same dead end. No answer, he muttered, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He glanced at Sasha. The silence so small, there's got to be another way to get in touch with them. Someone at the tavern might know how to reach them. Sasha nodded, though her eyes lingered on the blood-stained doorstep. Let's go get some breakfast. The sooner we figure this out, the better. The air was thick with the smell of salt and peat as the morning sun appeared to rise from the depths of the ocean, casting golden light over the endless waves. To the west, Sleepmore Mountain remained shrouded in a veil of mist, its dark silhouette looming like a sentinel over the quiet village below. The fog clung stubbornly to the hillsides, curling around the ruins of the old stone cottages like ghostly fingers. A steady roar of waves crashed against the jagged cliffs, punctuated by the occasional call of a gull circling overhead. Along the narrow path, damp moss glistened in the morning light, and droplets of dew hung from the edges of wild grasses, sparkling like tiny diamonds. It had rained most of the night, but now the sun was warming the earth, creating a slight mist that rose from the ground. Jack and Sasha walked along the cobblestone path towards a small tavern serving breakfast. The wind picked up, tugging at their jackets and carrying with it the faintest trace of something Jack couldn't quite place. Something ancient and earthy, like damp stone and heather. Sasha stopped outside the tavern, her eyes lingering on the green slopes of Sleepmore. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper carried on the wind. Jack opened the door for her and watched as she paused at the entrance. "What is it?" he asked softly. "Did you hear that?" she replied. Jack shook his head, Several large gulls suddenly appeared, flying over the tavern towards the fishing boat that was just coming to dock, their screeches creating an explosion of sound in the misty air. It was probably nothing, Sasha murmured, stepping into the warmth of the tavern. The tavern's interior was a sanctuary of warmth and charm, a sharp contrast to the crisp, misty air outside. The low wooden beams overhead were dark and weathered, their surfaces polished to a soft sheen by time and countless hands. A roaring fire crackled in the stone hearth, its golden light dancing across the walls adorned with a collection of old photographs, faded fishing nets, and an old tattered map of Achill Island. The air was filled with comforting scent of freshly baked soda bread mingled with the faint tang of sea salt and the earthly aroma of wood stove smoke. The chatter of voices filled the space, a soft hum of laughter and a conversation that ebbed and flowed like the tide. Locals sat at sturdy wooden tables, their faces lined with stories, their eyes twinkling with the easy camaraderie of neighbors who shared lifetimes together. Near the entrance, a group of fishermen in heavy-knit sweaters and weathered caps shared stories, their voices carrying a lilting melody that blended effortlessly with the faint strains of traditional Irish music playing softly in the background. As Jack and Sasha entered the tavern, a few heads turned, their gazes curious but friendly. "Morning to ye," an older man called out from a corner table, raising a steaming cup of coffee in greeting. Sasha returned his smile, instantly feeling lighter. The friendliness of the locals and the simple warmth of the place worked quickly to dispel the lingering unease of the morning's events. Jack guided her to a table near the large stone fireplace, the heat chasing away the dampness clinging to their clothes and bones. Within moments, a cheerful waitress appeared, her lilting accent thick with the cadence of county mail. She set down a basket of warm, butter-scented brown bread. "Straight out of the oven," she announced with a wink, her green eyes sparkling. "You'll not find better on this island." Jack smiled. "Thank you," he nodded. "By the way, do you know how we might get in touch with the local guard?" The waitress laughed. "Oh, there's no need for a local guard round these parts, lad. Closest one is in Kiel on the other side of the island. And there's one at Achill Sound over by the bridge." "No need for a local guard?" Jack repeated, arching an eyebrow. "What happens if there's trouble?" The waitress chuckled, placing a hand on her hip. "Trouble?" she teased, her voice light. "Achill doesn't take too kindly to trouble, so it rarely comes round. Folk here look after each other, and when we can't, well, word travels fast. But if it's serious, the lads over in Kiel or Achill Sound will be your best bet." "So, you're saying if something unusual happens, it'd stand out?" Sasha asked. "Oh, aye," the waitress said with a nod of her head, her tone dropping slightly. "Unusual things tend to leave their mark on folk here. You'd be surprised how stories have a way of sticking to the bones of a place like this." Sasha frowned, leaning forward. "What about something out of the ordinary? Something like," she hesitated, "a severed sheep's head left on a doorstep?" The waitress froze, her jovial expression fading as her gaze flickered between Jack and Sasha. She backed away from the table a step, the warmth in her green eyes dimmed, replaced by something sharper, guarded. "Now that," she said slowly, "isn't something we hear about often." The waitress glanced towards the corner of the tavern, where the older man who had greeted them earlier was watching closely. His coffee cup paused midair. He met her eyes, gave a small nod, and returned to his drink. Turning back to them, the waitress folded her hands across her chest. In a voice barely above a whisper, she warned, "If I were you, I'd be careful poking about where you don't belong. Achill holds its secrets tight." Jack exchanged a look with Sasha, unease prickling at the edge of his mind. "What kind of secrets?" he pressed. The waitress straightened, a forced smile returning to her face. "Enjoy your breakfast," she said briskly, stepping back. "I'll bring your coffee shortly." And with that, she was gone, leaving Jack and Sasha with more questions than answers, and a strange heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. There was an uncomfortable silence as the waitress brought their breakfast and refilled their coffee. She made a point of not looking either of them in the eye and retreated back to the kitchen as quickly as she could. "What are we going to do now?" Sasha whispered to Jack. "I think we make a drive over to Kiel and report it to the guard. We can put the bag in the trunk so they can hopefully identify whose sheep it is, and we've got photos to show them." "Let's get out of here," Jack replied quietly. There was no cordial greeting as they left the tavern, no smiles from the locals, though everyone turned and watched them leave. Jack stood frozen in front of the fisherman's cottage, staring at the door. The blood-red letters stood out starkly against the weathered wood, their message clear and chilling. Lig Dom. Sasha took a step forward, her eyes wide. "What does it mean?" she asked. Jack remembered seeing the same words somewhere else, though he couldn't recall where. Lig Dom, he repeated softly. Leave me. Sasha turned to him, her brow furrowing. Leave me? But why would someone write that? And why in blood? He didn't have an answer. The severed sheep's head, the strange warning, the tension in the tavern. It was all too much. Something dark was happening on Achill Island, and none of the pieces were falling into place. But Jack had a sinking feeling that the more they uncovered, the more they would wish they hadn't. He reached for the doorknob, his pulse quickening as he pushed the door open. Inside, the house was still and silent, but Jack could feel the weight of eyes on them, as though they weren't alone, as though the island itself was watching, waiting. "What do we do now?" Sasha asked. "We don't have the head anymore to show the police. We've got the photographs, and I think we still need to alert the authorities. It might have just been a prank, but I don't like the way the waitress acted when you mentioned it to her. And what was that thing about poking around where we don't belong?" They locked up the house and returned to the rental car. Just as they turned onto the main road out of town, they encountered the old man from the bar, the one who had originally greeted them. "Hello there," he called out as Jack pulled up beside him. He carried a walking stick. And as Jack slowed the vehicle to a stop, the man tapped the window of the car. Jack rolled down his window and asked, "Would you like a ride?" He noticed the man's walking stick and intricately carved runic symbols and shapes of animals. The old man peered into his car, his eyes sharp and glittering despite the deep lines of age on his face. No ride needed. Not whilst I can use my legs," he said, his voice carrying the same lilting cadence of the waitress in the tavern. "I just want to have a word with ye, if you don't mind." Jack glanced at Sasha, who nodded subtly. "Of course," Jack said, cutting the engine and rolling the window down further. The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Words travel fast on this island, you know. Heard about your little incident this morning." He straightened his expression, darkening. "If I were you, I'd heed the warning." Jack frowned. "The sheep's head? Just what kind of warning was it, and who would have given us that kind of warning?" The man let out a dry chuckle, more a rasp than a laugh. "Aye, I do. And if you've been asking questions about the Faoladh, then you're dabbling in things best left alone." He shifted his grip on the walking stick, his knuckles whitening. "This island's seen its fair share of secrets, lad. They don't like being disturbed." Sasha leaned over to the window. "What do you mean by that? Who doesn't like being disturbed?" The old man's eyes softened slightly as he looked at her, but there was still a hint of warning in his tone. "Not who, lass. What? This place, this land, it remembers. It doesn't take kindly to strangers prying into things they don't understand." He gestured with his stick towards Sleevemore, its mist-shrouded peak visible in the distance. "The Faoladh aren't just stories to be told at children's bedtime. They're part of the very bones of this place." Jack sat back, frustration coiling in his chest. "If you're trying to scare us, it's not going to work. We're just here to have a nice, peaceful vacation. We really don't want to get involved in the region's history or legends. We just want to understand what's going on and why we're being targeted." "Understand, is it?" The old man's voice sharpened. "Then take this as an understanding. Ye've been marked. That head wasn't just left as a prank, lad. It's a claim. They're watching ye now, and they'll not let you go until they're satisfied." The words hung heavy in the air. Jack and Sasha exchanged a look of unease. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. "What exactly are you warning us of?" The man's expression softened into something almost wistful. "Some are just too stubborn to see the cliff before they step off it." He tapped the car door gently with his stick and took a step back. "Mind your step, both of ye. Don't go poking about the ruins tonight." Without another word, he turned and began walking back towards the village, his stick tapping against cobblestones. Jack started the engine again, his mind trying to process what the old man's cryptic message could have meant. As they drove away, Sasha looked out the rearview mirror, but the old man had already disappeared into the mist. "Did any of that make sense to you?" asked Jack, as they sped along the two-lane highway that paralleled the cliffs. Not a word of it, replied Sasha. But it was a warning of some kind. And he specifically told us not to go poking around the ruins tonight. Jack looked at her and nodded his head. I heard that too. I think that's exactly where we need to be tonight. Maybe we'll find some answers. Sasha sighed, leaning back in her seat. You know this could be leading us into more trouble, right? Jack laughed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. And when has that ever stopped us? The guard station in Kiel, nestled beside a narrow road flanked by sodden fields, had been a dead end. The officers, polite but indifferent, seemed unconcerned by the photographs of the bloody warning. Probably just some local kids pulling a prank, one of them said with a dismissive wave, jotting down notes that felt more like a formality than an earnest investigation. They promised to check if anyone had reported a missing sheep, but Jack wasn't holding his breath. As they stepped out into the drizzle, Sasha looked at the brooding sky, gray clouds casting a heavy shadow over a small village. Well, that was a waste of time, she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter against the damp chill. Jack nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. Yeah, I don't think they're going to take this seriously, he glanced at her. What do you want to do? Head back to the cottage? Sasha hesitated, her gaze drifting to the distant hills shrouded in mist. No, not yet. Let's drive for a while. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe we'll stumble across something. I'm not ready to go back and sit in that house. Not after this morning. The drive to Kildownet Cemetery was quiet. The only sounds of the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield. The mist clung to the hillsides, and every so often the outline of a stone wall or grazing sheep would emerge from the fog before disappearing again. As they approached the cemetery, the road narrowed, flanked by tall hedgerows dripping with rainwater. The cemetery sat on a wind-swept hill overlooking Clew Bay, its ancient headstones standing like sentinels against the dark gray sky. Celtic crosses, weathered by centuries of salt, air, and rain, cast long shadows across the damp grass. The partially restored ruins of St. Dymphna's Church stood at the center, its crumbling stone walls a reminder of Ireland's deep and turbulent history. The sight was hauntingly beautiful. Sasha stepped out of the car and pulled her hood up against the drizzle. The air smelled of wet grass and peat, mingled with the faint tang of salt from the nearby sea. They walked among the graves, some marked with names so worn by time they were illegible. Others bore intricate carvings of spirals, knots, and scenes from ancient lore. Sasha paused a moment by one of the larger crosses, running her fingers over the rough surface. This one must be hundreds of years old, she said, her voice hushed. Jack nodded, his gaze drifting to the ruins of the church. There's something about this place, he said. It's like you can feel the history, the stories buried here. As they wandered deeper into the cemetery, Sasha noticed a small cluster of gravestones set apart from the others, their markings faintly different. Jack, look at these, she called out, pointing to the stones. The symbols etched into them were unlike the others, jagged lines and animal shapes that looked very similar to intricate carvings they had seen on the old man's walking stick. Jack crouched beside one, brushing away moss to reveal more of the intricate carvings. These look like some kind of pagan symbols, runes maybe. He ran his fingers over the carved stones, feeling the shapes. Sasha knelt beside him, taking photographs with her phone. Jack continued to walk among the stones, noting similarities in the shapes and figures when he heard Sasha gasp. Jack, look at this, she exclaimed with excitement. Sasha had brushed away the green moss clinging to the old headstone, revealing an intricate carving of a wolf's head. It was etched with incredible detail, its fierce eyes seeming to gleam even in the muted daylight. Her fingers traced the inscription, Mactires Adra, heir of the wolf. Her voice wavered as she pointed to the name at the bottom of the stone. Jack Moore. That's your name, Jack. Jack froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end as Sasha's words sank in. He quickly crossed the short distance to her side and knelt down by the headstone. That's quite a coincidence, he remarked. Sasha shook her head, pulling her phone out to snap a photo of the engraving. What are the chances? You're not Irish, right? There's no family connection here, she asked. I don't think so, Jack replied. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the stone's surface. Felt colder than the others, almost unnaturally so. His heart pounded as he looked back at Sasha. I'm sure it's just a random coincidence. The wind swirled around them, carrying with it an eerie howl that echoed through the ruins and sent a shiver racing down their spines. Jack turned his head sharply, his eyes scanning the mist-covered cemetery. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Let's get out of here," Sasha replied. "I want to find a bookstore or a library. I need to find out who Jack Moore is and what connection he might have to you." In a small, used bookstore in town, they found a copy of C. Thomas Kearney's book, Clans and Families of Ireland and Scotland, published in 1989. According to the historian, the O'Moores in Ireland were one of the chiefly families of the Lineage tribe, who in turn came from the Cryptic tribe, who were the first Celts to settle in Ireland from between 800 and 500 BC. The surname, Moore, is derived from the O'Moores. As Sasha flipped through the pages of the worn book, the sound of rain tapping against the windows added to the atmosphere as she traced her finger over the text. "Listen to this," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. "The O'Moores were known for their fierce loyalty and their ties to the land. There's something here about them being guardians of the wild." She paused, her brow furrowed. "It says that their lineage was believed to be intertwined with the myths of shapeshifters, wolves specifically. That would explain the wolf carving on the headstone." Jack leaned closer, scanning the text over her shoulder. "Guardians of the wild," Sasha muttered. "And the name Moore comes from the O'Moores. Sounds like your family's history is more connected to the Ireland than you realize. We've got to find out more about the wolf carvings, the ruins, and why someone doesn't want us poking around." Jack nodded, glancing out the window. The mist seemed thicker now, curling through the narrow streets like a living thing. "We've got to find someone to talk to, someone who can tell us what the hell is going on here." They headed for home with an armful of books from the history of Achill Island. As they approached the fisherman's cottage, the first thing they noticed was the flicker of light coming from inside. "Did you leave a light on?" Sasha asked, her voice a whisper. "No," Jack replied, his jaw tightening. "And I know I locked the door when we left, too." The rain had picked up again, a steady downpour that muted the sound of their footsteps as they crept towards the house. The faint glow of a lantern swayed in the front window, casting eerie shadows on the curtains. Jack motioned for Sasha to stay back as he reached for the door. To his surprise, it swung open easily, the lock broken and splintered. His pulse pounded as he stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit room. The smell of damp earth and something metallic hit them immediately. The house was empty, but on the kitchen table sat the trash bag they thought was gone, its black plastic smeared with blood. Next to it lay an object wrapped in coarse burlap. Jack unwrapped it carefully, the burlap falling away to reveal a stone carving. A wolf's head, eerily similar to the one on the headstone they'd found earlier. But this one had fresh blood smeared across its snarling face and a single rune etched into its forehead. Sasha gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "What does it mean?" Jack turned the carving over, his fingers brushing against the rough edges. As he did, the faint echo of a low, guttural growl rumbled through the house, coming from the back door. "Stay behind me," Jack said, his voice low and firm. Slowly, he moved toward the door, the growling growing louder with each step. When he finally pulled open the door, the mist surged in around them, and standing just beyond the threshold was a tall figure from the previous night. Underneath the hood of his cloak, Jack could see his eyes glowing an unnatural greenish gold. And then, in a voice that wasn't human, the tall figure spoke. "Lig Dom."
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Wolfman Chronicles, and I want to give a special thanks to Jack for reading it for us this week. I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. Till then, have a great week, everyone.